A young woman came home and stopped responding to messages. Her relatives began to worry, and the police quickly got involved. Soon, they found a number of very grim and strange clues, but they couldn't figure out what had happened to her for many years. This continued until investigators managed to make a very unexpected breakthrough and finally learn the truth. Carmen Van Huss was born on October 9, 1973, in the American city of Indianapolis, Indiana. She lived there with her parents and two younger brothers, but when Carmen was little, her parents decided to divorce. Despite this, she continued to spend a lot of time with her father, and they were very close. From childhood, Carmen loved drawing and animals. According to her parents, she couldn't walk past stray cats and constantly brought them home. The girl also began to think about becoming a veterinarian, but later decided to pursue an education related to art. After high school, Carmen enrolled at Indiana University in the School of Fine Arts, and also got a job at a pizzeria. The young woman didn't want to live off her parents, especially considering they needed to support her younger brothers. At that time, she was also in a relationship, and in October of 1992, she and her boyfriend decided to rent their first place. The couple settled in an apartment complex not far from her work, and from then on, she worked towards getting her degree and building a future career in art. On March 22, 1993, when Carmen was 19, she went with her father and brother to visit her grandmother in the hospital. Afterward, she drove them home, and her father suggested she stay over. It was already late in the evening, and the young woman's apartment complex was on the opposite side of town, so the man was worried about his daughter. Carmen said she needed to wash her work uniform before her shift at the pizzeria the next day, said goodbye to her relatives, and drove home. 2 days later, Carmen's friend stopped by her work hoping Carmen could help her get a job there. However, the friend was surprised to find that Carmen wasn't there. After speaking with the manager, she found out that Carmen hadn't shown up for work since the previous day. He had tried to call her several times, but the young woman didn't answer. The manager assumed she simply didn't want to work there anymore, so she hadn't come in for her shift. But this seemed too strange to her friend. She knew Carmen was a very responsible person, and she had never mentioned planning to quit. The friend explained all this to the manager and asked him to check if they had a phone number for any of her relatives on file. When she was hired, Carmen had left her father's number, and the manager contacted him. The father said he had called her the day before, but Carmen didn't pick up. At the time, he thought she was just busy at work, but now he began to seriously worry about her. The man immediately drove to her apartment complex to check if everything was okay. The first thing he saw was her boyfriend's car, which Carmen sometimes drove, parked near the building, and her purse was inside. He found a note on it left by the apartment complex manager. It said that several neighbors had complained about late-night noise from her apartment, and the manager was asking her to be quieter. Her father started knocking on her apartment door, but no one answered. Soon, he discovered the front door was unlocked and went inside. As soon as the man crossed the threshold, a horrifying sight unfolded before him. The girl was lying on the floor. Part of her clothing was missing. He immediately ran out of the apartment and called 911. However, when the paramedics arrived, they could only pronounce the young woman deceased. They also quickly realized they were dealing with a homicide and called the police to the scene. Investigators began examining the crime scene and started questioning the victim's neighbors. Noticing the manager's noise complaint on Carmen's door, they spoke with the manager and learned that several residents had complained about noise from her apartment that morning. Around 1:30 a.m., they heard Carmen return, and based on the voices, a man was with her. As they were going up to her third-floor apartment, Carmen was laughing, and the man's voice also sounded happy and calm. Then, around 1:30 in the morning, the neighbors heard Carmen again, but this time she screamed, "Get off me!" after which someone ran out of the apartment, and the noise stopped. Despite how suspicious this all sounded, none of the neighbors thought to call the police. All they did was go to the complex manager the next morning and complain about the noise. The police spoke with these neighbors, and they explained their actions as follows. They all assumed the man Carmen came home with was her boyfriend, so they didn't find the incident suspicious. Thus, the police surmised that the young woman was killed at the exact moment the neighbors heard the scream, meaning almost 2 days before her body was discovered. Inside the apartment, they found empty food wrappers and several beer bottles, indicating that Carmen had spent the evening in the company of an unknown person. It all looked as if she knew him well. She let this person into her apartment, spent several hours with him, and only after that, he apparently attacked her. Most likely, he committed the crime right in the living room where they were sitting and eating. Signs of a struggle pointed to this, such as an overturned table and Carmen's torn clothing scattered on the floor. Additionally, detectives determined that the perpetrator likely went to the kitchen after the incident to wash blood off himself, and only then left the apartment. Medical experts determined that Carmen had received more than 60 wounds from a sharp object, and one of her earrings was missing, as if the perpetrator had taken it. Furthermore, Carmen had been attacked, and experts were able to retrieve the perpetrator's biological material. However, in those years, DNA analysis was not sufficiently advanced, and experts couldn't get a profile of the perpetrator from the available samples. After examining all the evidence collected in the apartment, experts also couldn't find any traces of the perpetrator's DNA or his fingerprints. Thus, they had no leads, no witnesses, or any other hints as to who this mysterious perpetrator might be. It's also worth noting that nothing of value was missing from the apartment, so investigators completely ruled out robbery as a motive. Naturally, the first question the police asked was where her boyfriend had been all this time, and whether he had any connection to the incident. However, this theory was quickly dismissed. Detectives found out the young man was in Arizona, several thousand miles from Indianapolis. The police received indisputable confirmation of his alibi, and the boyfriend was removed from the list of suspects. Next, detectives began looking at all of Carmen's friends and acquaintances. Based on the available information, the motive for the crime was apparently an attack. For this reason, they focused on studying the men Carmen was close with, but not in a romantic relationship with. They checked her acquaintances and colleagues, but none of them could be linked to the incident. Given that the police didn't have a single solid piece of evidence, they could only hope that one of these people might be given away by fresh scratches, strange behavior, or other indirect factors. But this led nowhere. Carmen's funeral was held a week after the incident, and her relatives faced another blow. The victim's grandmother, who was in the hospital, passed away right during the funeral, and Carmen's father received the call from the hospital while standing next to his daughter's casket. Besides this being the second loss for the family in just a few days, they were also facing financial difficulties and simply didn't have money for another funeral. In the end, their friends had to organize a fundraiser to cover these costs, and with the help of caring people, they managed to raise the necessary amount. Over the next few weeks, the police tried to find any leads, but they came up empty. They appealed to the public through the media, urging anyone with information about the case to come forward. However, none of the tips they received brought them any closer to solving this mystery. From then on, there was absolutely no progress in the case, and it stalled for many years. Police periodically reviewed it, but time after time, they failed to find any new leads. Carmen's family also continued to fight for justice. They regularly contacted detectives and gave interviews to local TV stations and newspapers, urging people to share any information, but it all led nowhere. Her father was never able to return to a normal life after his daughter's passing. He spent several years trying to get justice, until he passed away in a car accident in 2002. Since then, Carmen's younger brother Jimmy took over the case. He constantly contacted the police, hoping to learn about any new leads, but they just repeated that they still didn't have a single piece of evidence. This went on for more than 20 years. And during that time, detectives didn't get any closer to catching the person responsible. In 2013, a detective named William Carter took an interest in the case. He wasn't involved in homicide investigations and handled other crimes. However, in his spare time, Carter regularly studied unsolved cases and had even successfully solved one. He contacted the relatives and immersed himself in the investigation, working on it only in his free time. This process stretched on for many months. First, he requested a reanalysis of the evidence found in Carmen's apartment for the presence of external DNA. Experts examined several items taken from the trash bag, and they indeed found genetic material. However, there was a problem. Experts could only isolate a partial DNA sample, which wasn't enough to identify its owner. The only thing they could tell was that the sample belonged to a male. Then, in 2015, Carter arranged for the lab to analyze the DNA from biological samples taken from the victim's body. The detective hoped that modern analysis tools would allow them to get the perpetrator's profile, and the case would finally be solved. But he was in for an unpleasant surprise. The lab results showed that the perpetrator's DNA belonged to a female. Carter immediately knew something was wrong, and eventually found out that the experts had simply mixed up Carmen's own samples with the perpetrator's samples. He then requested a new analysis, but this time, the lab refused. They cited a lack of funding and refused to correct their mistake. On top of that, the police department had paid the lab $1,600 for the first analysis where they mixed up the samples, and that money was never refunded. The department refused to pay for a repeat analysis. However, Carter wasn't planning to give up. He believed that re-examining the evidence could finally help bring the person responsible to justice, so he decided to take a rather unusual step. He created a fundraising page called Justice for Carmen. Moreover, the detective covered part of the necessary amount out of his own pocket. To Carter's surprise, in just 7 hours he managed to raise even more than planned. He announced that all the extra money would be added to the reward for information on the case, which at that time was $10,000. The lab agreed to conduct a repeat DNA test, this time with the correct samples. However, a rather unexpected problem arose. Just 2 days after the fundraiser, he called Carmen's brother and told him he had been forbidden from continuing to work on the case. The police department leadership didn't directly say it was because of the fundraiser for the test, but it was quite obvious. Furthermore, the fundraiser caused a mixed reaction in the community. Some didn't understand why the police couldn't pay for such important tests, forcing them to chip in, but others supported Carter's initiative. Immediately after the victim's brother learned of the decision, he created a petition demanding Carter be put back on the case. The petition attracted the attention of local media and hundreds of people, who began flooding the police department with angry messages. The public reaction was so strong that the police had to call a press conference that same day. They stated there had been a misunderstanding, and that no one had forbidden Carter from working on the investigation. In addition, the police announced they would return all the donated money, and the police department would pay for the repeat test itself. In the end, the detective returned to work and requested a new analysis of the biological samples taken from the victim's body. This time, the experts studied the correct sample and were finally able to extract a full DNA profile of an unknown male. But here, another problem arose. He was not in the FBI database, which meant the police still couldn't identify him. Over the next few years, Carter tried to check every male acquaintance of Carmen's, who theoretically could have been in her apartment that night. The detective was convinced the victim knew this person well. However, he was still unable to get any closer to catching the person responsible. This continued until 2023, when the police department turned to a company called Parabon. They decided to try a relatively new method called genetic genealogy, which had already helped solve hundreds of cases. Its essence is that experts take an unknown person's DNA sample and start searching for their relatives in open genetic databases where people upload their profiles. Most often, the relationship is very distant, and these people may not even know the DNA owner exists, but any results are enough for the experts. After finding relatives, they begin to study their family trees, trying to get closer to the possible DNA owner by eliminating unsuitable candidates based on age, gender, location, and other criteria. This continues until they land on the most likely candidate, and then the police just need to get their DNA sample for confirmation. Given that all this time detectives had failed to get any closer to catching the perpetrator, this method was their last hope. Experts began their work, and after a few months, they found a man who fit the perpetrator's criteria. It was 52-year-old Dana Shepard. Police learned that at the time of Carmen's passing, he not only lived in the same complex as her, but literally in the next-door apartment. Shepard also had an impressive criminal history, but the vast majority of his crimes were non-violent, which is why the man's DNA was not in the FBI database. He had been convicted of theft, car theft, driving without a license, and other similar offenses. Detectives also discovered that this man, for some unknown reason, was completely absent from the case files. Apparently, the police were initially convinced the attacker had fled the scene, as neighbors heard footsteps down the stairs, and they didn't even consider that he had been living just a few feet from Carmen's apartment the whole time. At the time the DNA results came in, Shepard was living in Missouri and working as a janitor at a university. Detectives immediately requested a warrant for a direct sample of his DNA and traveled to the other state. When they arrived at the man's home and presented the warrant, he began to tremble noticeably, but he provided his biological sample. It was immediately sent to the lab, and experts confirmed a perfect match. In September 2024, the man was arrested and extradited to Indiana, Despite the DNA match, Shepard refused to admit his guilt, and the case was sent to court. The trial has not yet begun, but the prosecution believes they have every chance of achieving justice. According to their theory, Carmen was well acquainted with Shepard, and that evening, they went to her apartment to have dinner and drink beer. Based on neighbor testimony, at some point, the man began to make advances on her, and Carmen tried to fight him off, but he attacked her. Currently, the man remains behind bars awaiting trial, as he was denied bail. The victim's brother thanked the detectives for finally being able to identify the suspect, even though it took more than 30 years. Now, he and Carmen's other relatives must go through a trial process that could drag on for several years. One thing is already known. If Shepard is found guilty, he could face up to 105 years in prison. However, the prosecution may be keeping other evidence secret that further points to his involvement, and we will only find out about it during the trial. But even the DNA match alone should be enough to convince the jury of Shepard's guilt, or to persuade the man himself to take a plea deal in which he admits guilt. Share your opinion about this story in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. I also recommend subscribing to our Telegram channel, where we post the most interesting, uncensored crime news from around the world every day. Thanks for watching.